Hey, welcome to 12 Tone. What kind of music do you think of when you hear the term butt rock? Which songs come to mind? Which bands? What do they sound like? What do they look like? And who listens to them? These are real questions, by the way. Feel free to share your answers in the comments, especially if you've never heard of it before. Anyway, I've been thinking about this a lot lately. I find it kind of fascinating that there are these whole genres of music that, by any reasonable metric, are immensely popular, but no one seems to be willing to admit that they like them. Which is a shame, because dismissing the entirety of butt rock means missing out on a lot of really fun music. So in this video, I'd like to offer a defense of butt rock as an artistic movement, but before we do that, we first have to figure out what butt rock actually means. First of all, I should probably clarify my use of the term butt rock because it sounds a lot like an insult, but that's not my intent. I genuinely believe that all art has merit. And even if I didn't, I personally enjoy a lot of bands that are often labeled as butt rock, so it might seem like a good idea to use a different, more neutral sounding name instead. But I'm not going to do that, for a couple reasons. First, many butt rock fans have been perfectly happy to reclaim the term and use it to describe their own musical tastes, so it's not quite as insulting as it might seem. But second, and more importantly, genres are complicated. I have a whole video about that, and a whole podcast episode. It's something I think about a lot. Basically, when we decide to call something a genre, we're not just talking about a set of sounds. We're also talking about a culture, a history, an attitude, a fashion sense, and an outside perception, among other things. And with so many moving parts, it shouldn't be surprising that the name we choose for a genre can change our understanding of it. A genre's name is how we define the boundaries between music that belongs and music that doesn't, and it carries clear implications about the defining features of that music. Like, back in the late 60s, bands like Black Sabbath, Iron Butterfly, and Deep Purple were doing something new, but we hadn't yet decided what to call it. Different fans preferred different names. They all eventually agreed on heavy metal, but that wasn't the only option. Like in 1971, Rolling Stone did a feature on Black Sabbath where they described the band's sound using another popular term coined by their drummer, Bill Ward. They called it downer rock. And if you listen to, say, War Pigs,
generals gathered in their masses.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. It's a good description of most of what these early metal pioneers were doing. But if we skip ahead a couple decades to a later metal band like Dragon Force, suddenly downer rock doesn't feel so appropriate. If heavy metal hadn't won out, would these two bands still feel like they were part of the same genre? Probably not. So while I could use a more neutral term like, say, arena rock and still manage to capture a lot of the same ideas, that's not really the question I'm asking. I want to know what we mean when we talk about butt rock, and to do that, I have to be able to call it butt rock. But why do we call it that at all? It's hard to say. If you search for the origins of the name, you'll find a couple competing theories. Probably the most common is that it comes from listeners making fun of a radio ad campaign. In the 90s, some stations apparently described themselves as playing nothing but rock, so the music those stations played became butt rock. And yeah, maybe, but I'm suspicious of this explanation. It feels too good to be true. It's a cute story with some clever wordplay, which is often a red flag for a folk etymology, a made-up origin story for an already existing term. Plus, there's also the fact that pretty much every article that tells this story cites back to the same unsourced Urban Dictionary definition. Now, that's not to say this ad campaign didn't happen. I don't remember hearing that slogan as a kid, but with the help of some Twitter followers, we did manage to track down some stations that definitely used it. There was no direct evidence of an organized nationwide campaign like the story implies, but that's not surprising. It's a 20-year-old radio gimmick. It's not going to leave a huge footprint on the historical record. So yeah, this probably happened, but while the slogan seems to have existed, I don't think it's the source of the name because the timeline doesn't add up. When people use this explanation, it's always in reference to what I'd call second wave butt rock. I'll get into the different eras in a bit, but for now, what matters is that the second wave took shape in the late 90s and early 2000s. But that's not when people started saying butt rock. In a 1994 interview for the book Soundgarden New Metal Crown, Soundgarden drummer Matt Cameron described a 1991 tour where the band was opening for Guns N' Roses. They had trouble connecting with an audience that didn't already know their music, so in order to keep the crowd happy, Cameron says they adapted by playing butt rock, which he defines like this.
Butt rock is just the stupidest basic 3-chord rock you can possibly play, and it works with big crowds like this who don't know you as a band.
So the term was already in use by 94, and probably even back in 91 during the tour. And that makes sense because, as you might imagine, second wave butt rock was not the first thing to be called butt rock. The term was already in use to describe certain bands from the 1980s. Of course, there are plenty of theories for why it applies to that era too. One common anecdote is that it refers to the fact that performers would often wear leather pants so tight that you could clearly see the shape of their butt. And again, maybe, but I think the simplest explanation is readily apparent from Cameron's definition. Butt rock is an insult. In his essay on the genre, Mark Lee points out that the late 80s saw the popularization of the term butthead as an insult towards someone's intelligence, class, and social graces. A butthead is loud, obnoxious, arrogant, and ignorant, and from there it's pretty easy to understand butt rock as rock music for buttheads. It's music made for the lowest common denominator. It seems entirely plausible to me that the Nothing But Rock campaign served as a catalyst for listeners to apply this term they were already familiar with to a new style of music. But if you ask me how it started, I'd say it was probably just people being mean. But enough about the name. What does butt rock actually sound like? Well, I'd argue that the history of butt rock can be broken up into three distinct eras. The first wave of butt rock runs from the late 70s to the early 90s. Some major bands include Quiet Riot, Kiss, Poison, and Bon Jovi. Musically, the first wave was built on fast guitar riffs, high male vocals, and the infamous shotgun snare. Visually, this era was defined by spectacle and especially costumes, ranging from Angus Young's schoolboy uniform to Dee Snider's makeup, Slash's iconic top hat, and Motley Crue's whole thing. Later in the decade, many butt rock artists would gravitate toward the same big hair, mesh shirts, and leather pants that would earn them the nickname hair metal. In short, the first wave of butt rock was both larger and louder than life. Eventually, though, all things must end, and the popularity of butt rock came crashing down in the early 90s with the rise of grunge. Grunge and the alt-rock movement in general were in many ways a reaction to and rejection of the increasingly cartoonish antics of late 80s butt rock bands. These artists combined more casual outfits like t-shirts and flannel jackets with an increased focus on serious material in their lyrics, recentering the rock world after the extravagance of the 1980s. But it wouldn't be long before butt rock returned in a new form, having learned new lessons. The second wave of butt rock spans from the late 90s to the mid-2000s. Here, bands like Nickelback, Shinedown, Breaking Benjamin, and Seether took the butt rock formula in a new direction, blending it with a more down-to-earth fashion sense of grunge and borrowing sounds from nu metal. Second wave butt rock is typically darker and slower than the first wave, with heavier distortion on the guitars, and vocalists singing in more of a middle register with a richer, thicker tone. Lyrically, it was more angsty than its predecessor, with many songs, especially the ballads, focusing on themes of loss and heartbreak. There was still plenty of that same butt rock bravado, but there was also an undercurrent of acceptable vulnerability. There's not as clear an explanation for why the second wave ended, but by the late 2000s, mainstream interest in these sorts of sounds had dwindled. Those were my late teenage years, and as I recall, a lot of what happened was that modern hard rock as a whole kinda left the spotlight, replaced by less heavy hybrid styles like pop rock, folk rock, and dance rock. Much like grunge was in part a response to the over-the-top spectacle of first-wave butt rock, I think this new, softer alt-rock movement can be understood as a response to the overwhelming intensity of the second wave. Anyway, no matter the cause, by the early 2010s, the second wave of butt rock was over, leaving room for a third wave to form. Now, this one's gonna be a little controversial. You may not agree with me that this counts as butt rock, but hear me out, because I'm pretty sure I'm onto something. Back when I was in college, sometime around 2013, I started to notice a new genre of rock on the radio. I wasn't sure what to call it, so I mostly just referred to it as the Imagine Dragons genre, made up of Imagine Dragons and bands that sounded like Imagine Dragons, including Bastille,
but if you close your eyes, does it almost feel like
Ex-Ambassadors, and Congos. Although, looking back, the band that really kicked off this trend was probably Fun. These bands incorporated the sonic elements of the new alt-rock scene, but with a more explosive kind of energy, and while I didn't realize it at the time, what I was witnessing was the birth of the third wave of butt rock. This still ongoing musical movement has many of the hallmarks of the butt rock genre, including a bunch of largely unjustified hate from mainstream rock fans, but in order to explain how, we have to finally ask the big question. What is butt rock? A lot of sources seem to point back to Mark Lee's essay on this, so let's start there. Lee argues that butt rock is best understood not as its own distinct genre, but in opposition to what he calls head rock. Head rock is rock music that's innovative and experimental. It pushes boundaries, tries new things, and celebrates virtuosity and technical skill. Head rock both requires and rewards careful thought and deep listening. Butt rock, on the other hand, takes the superficial characteristics of whatever head rock is doing at the time and repackages it in a simplified form, appealing less to the intellect and more to the base emotions. In short, head rock leads while butt rock follows. I don't love this explanation. Despite Lee's insistence that head rock and butt rock are not the same as good rock and bad rock, it's hard not to read it that way when one is, by definition, a shadow of the other. Now, it is fair to say that butt rock is a reaction to the culture that surrounds it. All art is. And historically, butt rock tends to rear its head whenever the pendulum of mainstream rock culture swings too far toward quote-unquote serious music. The first wave followed the 70s, where bands like Genesis, Pink Floyd, Led Zeppelin, and The Who were all experimenting with complex harmonies, rhythms, and forms, with lyrics full of dense symbolism and intricate narrative fantasies. The second wave followed the 90s, where bands like Pearl Jam, Soundgarden, and Nine Inch Nails were again pushing boundaries with both their music and their lyrical themes. And the third wave followed the late 2000s, where modern rock had largely disappeared from the spotlight, leaving the conversation to focus on those same bands from the 70s and 90s that inspired the first two waves. So, yes, butt rock can be understood as a reaction to more heady styles, but those reactions still contain their own innovations. They're just not in the sorts of places we tend to look for musical complexity. Overall, I think it's a mistake to define a genre exclusively by what it's not. I also think Lee is relying on too narrow a concept of genre. A central part of his argument is that the different eras of butt rock don't seem to have much in common musically. And sure, it's true that Warrant doesn't sound like Trapped, and neither of them sound like One Republic.
I got my mind made up, man, I can't let go.
But again, Black Sabbath doesn't sound like Dragon Force. Doesn't mean they're not both metal. When you're trying to understand a genre, especially on longer historical timescales, it's often less useful to ask what it sounds like and more useful to ask what it wants. What is the music trying to accomplish? And to get to that, we'll have to look at which elements of butt rock have stayed largely the same over time. Like in one of his videos on the topic, YouTuber Finn McKenty, the punk rock MBA, points out that butt rock tends to be focused on singles. And that's unusual. In traditional rock culture, the basic unit of music is the album. You rarely hear Pink Floyd fans arguing about whether Money is better than Comfortably Numb. No, the debate is almost always Dark Side of the Moon or The Wall. And the same is true for most rock bands, Led Zeppelin 4 or Houses of the Holy, Nevermind or In Utero, Sgt. Pepper or The White Album, The Black Album or Master of Puppets. Individual songs serve as supporting arguments for the albums they're a part of. Butt rock doesn't really play that game. There's a famous, although probably fake, quote from AC/DC's Angus Young, who supposedly said,
"I'm sick to death of people saying we've made 11 albums that sound exactly the same. In fact, we've made 12 albums that sound exactly the same."
Side note, if anyone knows where this is actually from, please let me know. It's a great quote and I'd love to be able to cite it, but I've only ever seen it as an unsourced anecdote. It's never tied to a specific interview or event. Even if it's not real though, he has said other similar things because for a band like AC/DC, making distinct albums was never really the point. The point was to sound like AC/DC, and once they figured out what that sound was, there wasn't much reason to change it. And the same is true across butt rock's history. I'm probably familiar with dozens of Nickelback songs, but for the life of me I couldn't name a Nickelback album, and until I started researching this video, I wasn't even sure Imagine Dragons had made one. Butt rock songs are designed to exist just fine outside of the context of their albums as compact, self-contained musical events. And a big part of that is the chorus. There's a reason every example I played in this video has been the start of the song's chorus. These sections are explosive events with hooks that hit like a freight train. They're catchy and memorable, but they're also heavy. They're easy to connect with and identify, but typically not easy to sing, either because of the high range, because the singer is using vocal distortion, or in many cases both. A butt rock chorus is a declaration of power, and if you don't feel it in your chest, then it's not doing its job. It's a moment of unity between the listener and the band, a sheer cathartic release that perfectly encapsulates the sonic strength of the music. That leads to what I believe is the central mission of butt rock, to capture the experience of a concert as clearly and efficiently as possible. Not like a live recording though. A live recording captures the events of a show, but not necessarily the energy or the spectacle. It's like, have you ever seen an action movie where a character throws a punch and it sounds like this? Yeah, that's not what a punch sounds like. Not even close. But it is what a punch feels like. By layering a bunch of different sounds on top of each other, it manages to evoke the idea of a punch more effectively and at a more visceral level than a more accurate recording would ever have been able to do. It's that heightening of reality that makes action scenes feel so exciting. If you want to see a realistic fight, you can watch MMA, but if you want to see an awesome fight, you watch Bruce Lee. And that's what butt rock is, the Bruce Lee of concert music. A butt rock song is a miniature version of a butt rock show, transporting you into that raucous crowd right from the start and not letting you leave until it's done. And by compressing all that energy into single songs, butt rock allows you to chain a number of those experiences together, running through a series of idealized rock shows, overwhelming you with theatric visuals, excessive emotions, and heart-poundingly heavy hooks, all before the DJ even has to cut to a commercial break. So while many styles of rock have their own performance practices, butt rock feels different. In butt rock, you don't just get to imagine what a live show would look like. In butt rock, you can hear the stage. That's because across all three eras, butt rock has always been obsessed with confidence and spectacle. What this sounds like may vary from decade to decade and band to band, but whatever butt rock is doing, it's doing it 110%. There are no quiet, introspective butt rock songs. All their ballads are power ballads, and all their volume knobs are turned to 11. Musically, this manifests as a sort of maximalism, taking up as much of the acoustic space as possible. But it's not just about creating a wall of sound. Butt rock relies on a form of reproducible maximalism, because at the end of the day, this still needs to feel like a live show. You need to be able to imagine 4 dudes on a stage playing all this. Like, sure, it'd sound great to bring in a 30-piece string section for the studio recording, but are you gonna take that on tour? Not unless you've got a ridiculous budget. Butt rock production is happy to do things like layering a dozen guitar tracks to get the full tone they want, as long as the audience won't notice. Otherwise, you risk shattering the illusion, and butt rock can never shatter the illusion. This polished maximalist approach opens butt rock up to accusations of commercialism, where rock's rough edges are rounded off to make it appeal to as large a market as possible, and yeah, I don't disagree. Butt rock is easy to enjoy, and its single-minded focus on conveying the raw energy of music makes it a very accessible style, which in turn makes it very profitable. But so what? It also makes it extremely fun, and there's plenty of value in that too. But there is a dark side to butt rock, and before we wrap up, I think we have to talk about it. By focusing on creating the most viscerally compelling rock music possible, butt rock becomes a lightning rod for all of the worst elements of rock culture, and rock culture has long had issues with toxic masculinity. Butt rock has a habit of uncritically accepting and even celebrating those ideas, with a lot of songs reflecting themes of violence, drugs and alcohol, masculine bravado, and most commonly, overt misogyny. Not every butt rock band does this, of course, but it's not hard to find examples like Motley Crue's Girls, 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 or Buckcherry's Crazy Bitch. And yeah, this is a problem. I'm not going to pretend it's not, and I'm not going to tell you that you need to look past it. Everyone has a right to their own comfort level, and if the prevalence of songs like this make you uncomfortable with butt rock as a whole, I get it. I will say, though, that this sort of thing seems to be largely missing from the third wave. There's still plenty of machismo, but not nearly as much objectification. That's not really a theme these bands seem all that interested in exploring, especially compared to their predecessors. Maybe that reflects changing cultural attitudes of what a man is supposed to be? Dunno, I'll leave that question for the sociologists. So, yeah, butt rock isn't perfect, and there are real and valid things to criticize it for. But there's also extremely silly things to criticize it for, and that seems to be the bulk of the criticism it gets. Rock culture, especially classic rock culture, has always had a bit of an obsession with attaining the status of high art, transcending the realm of the merely enjoyable by creating intricate, challenging works that really make you think. Rock fans tend to fetishize things like innovation, technique, and seriousness, and treat them as the criteria by which all music should be judged. It's easy to write off butt rock because it doesn't play by those rules, but I don't know, maybe those rules suck? I mean, from its origins with artists like Chuck Berry and Little Richard, rock music has also been about having a blast. Butt rock is carrying on that tradition of fun, and fun stuff is a lot harder to make than people give it credit for. That's it, but real quick, before we go, I wanted to let y'all know that my podcast, Ghost Notes, is coming up on its 2nd birthday, and to celebrate, Noah and I are gonna do a mailbag episode, so if you have any questions you want to hear the creators of 12 Tone and Polyphonic discuss, we're collecting those on Twitter. There's a link to the thread in the description. And if you don't listen to Ghost Notes, maybe check it out. I think it's pretty good. It's available in all the normal podcast places, and if you happen to have Nebula, you can get early access to new episodes there. Anyway, thanks for watching, thanks to our Patreon patrons for making these videos possible, and extra special thanks to our featured patrons, Susan Jones, Jill Sundgaard, Duck, Howard Levine, Warren Huart, Kevin Wilamowski, Grant Aldonas, and Michael Mole. If you want to help out and help us pick the next song we analyze too, there's a link to our Patreon on screen now. Oh, and don't forget to like, share, comment, subscribe, and above all, keep on rockin'.